All right, welcome back. We are officially through the Old Testament in our analysis of Sabbath. And so we are going to go through Sabbath in the New Testament. In the next four segments, we're going to address several different categories. We're going to address the Sabbath in the Gospels. We're going to address the Sabbath in Acts, in the book of Acts. We're going to address the Sabbath in the epistles of Paul. And then our fourth segment will be addressing Sabbath in the book of Hebrews. And then we will finally draw it to a close where we will finalize this topic as we move through the New Testament. So today, what we're going to be addressing is specifically our part one to the Sabbath in the New Testament. What specifically? We're going to deal with the Gospels. Okay, the Gospels are going to highlight three major areas of conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees. The first area of conflict, his claim to be the Messiah. The second area of conflict, his rejection of the Mishnah and rabbinic traditions, such as things like ritual hand washing and fasting. Those were all rabbinic and Mishnah traditions. The third area of conflict is the correct way to observe the Sabbath. Now, among these, the Sabbath became a particularly contentious issue. If you don't know much about Rabbinic Judaism, in Rabbinic Judaism, the Sabbath had evolved into an end in itself. It became the idol, so to speak, with the belief in Judaism that Israel's very purpose and their existence was to observe it. This is what they lived for. The Sabbath was, even in Jewish writings, it was personified and revered as a queen, what's called Melchat Shabbat, and a bride called Kalah. So I want to side note on these two Hebrew thoughts or phrases. First of all, this queen concept. In Jewish thought, the Sabbath is often personified as a queen. It shows up as Melkah. And I'm probably butchering the Hebrew because I'm not a Hebrew linguist, but you get the idea. It was symbolizing peace, holiness, divine presence. This idea is actually found in the Lecha Dodi prayer, which welcomes Shabbat as a bride or queen. Shabbat HaMelach. All right. The second thought. Shabbat is often depicted as a bride in Jewish tradition. It's an image most famously expressed in the Kabbalistic hymn Lecha Dodi. And I mentioned it just a second ago. It's actually a hymn by Rabbi Shlomo Elkabetz in the 16th century. The refrain of this song, sung during Kabbalat Shabbat, welcomes Shabbat as a bride, Kalah. It actually emphasizes the joy and the intimate relationship between the Jewish people and the Sabbath. It's akin to this bond between the bride and the groom. However, the Pharisees, as they began to kind of put rules and regulations around it, by adding countless additional fences or rules and regulations, they began to turn the Sabbath into a burden rather than a day of rest and refreshment. Jesus is going to directly confront this distortion, and he declares that they have completely misunderstood the Sabbath's purpose. He emphasizes that the Sabbath was designed to serve humanity, not to enslave it. We see this in Mark chapter 2, verse 27, where he states, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This is a common text that I see Adventists beginning to misquote because they get the entire idea of Sabbath confused. So what does it actually mean? Well, this means that the Sabbath was instituted for the benefit of Israel. Not that Israel existed to serve the Sabbath. Furthermore, as the Messiah who's speaking here, Jesus himself declares in Matthew chapter 12, verse 8, another text that gets ripped out of context and proof text by Seventh-day Adventists, that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. What does this mean? Well, it's signifying that he had complete authority over its proper observance. He could permit things that the Pharisees forbade, and he could forbid things that they permitted. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. It's very evident that Jesus kept the Sabbath according to the requirements of the Mosaic Law. He was a Jew. But he didn't always follow the additional legalistic traditions, the rabbinic traditions that were imposed by the Pharisees. In fact, this fact does not imply the fact that he kept the Sabbath. It doesn't imply that Jewish or Gentile believers today, that they're obligated in some way to keep the Sabbath. That would be a false dilemma. Of course, Jesus lived under the Mosaic Law. He was a Jew. And of course, he perfectly obeyed all 613 commandments applicable to him as an Israelite, as a Jew, whether they were moral, whether they were ceremonial, whether they were civil, or any other way that you might try to dice it up. Remember, it's all one unit. If one was to argue that believers must keep the Sabbath simply because Jesus did, then logically, if you follow that argument, believers today would also be required to observe every other Mosaic commandment in its entirety, including any of those that you would potentially classify as ceremonial, civil, dietary, whatever classification you would use. Jesus kept it. You should too. Jesus kept it. It is notable, and I have to point this out, that of all the commandments that Jesus issued, if you look at the text, of all the commandments that Jesus issued for his followers, such as if you look at the upper room discourse in John chapter 13 through 17, if you look at that discourse, it is notable that the Sabbath was never included as a requirement. And no, it's not a strong argument to argue from an argument of silence. Well, he was a Jew. Everyone understood it. No. Nowhere in the Gospels does Jesus instruct his disciples to continue Sabbath observance under the new commandment, the new covenant. Nowhere. It doesn't exist. Instead, what we find is that his teachings, they emphasize his authority over the Sabbath and the coming shift in covenantal structure. This absence, it reinforces the New Testament's broader teaching that the law of Moses, including the Sabbath, has been set aside for what is better in favor of the law of Christ.